justify ships going up there, you know, potential. I mean, anytime you put somebody up there, there's a chance a ship's going to go up on a reef, or something's going to spill, or it's going to transport, you know, an invasive species. So in the end, the question was, so what? So certainly the cultural stuff was put out there and talked about to a large degree. At the same time, though, it was just as much about, you know, to what degree is this science really going to advance, ecosystem science advance management of the resource. And I was put on notice from the very beginning that this was going to be, you know, run by management and not by my particular science interests. And so it was an interesting process. And now that the plan is over, it's kind of too bad, because we had a regular set of meetings where we sat in the room, and it was the kind of dialogue we're having here. And so to have that on a periodic basis, you know, once a month, that's not altogether, that's pretty valuable, you know, for a regional management activity.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Sure.
So it's an opportunity now to invite the presenters to come down for a panel, and we have a chance to pepper them with more questions. I'd like to thank them for excellent presentation, very stimulating. So Andre primed the pump by asking me to ask a question, which is, I guess this would be particularly questions for the people not in the U.S., but what do you feel is that some of the lessons or some of the things that you've learned in either New Zealand or the EU, is there anything that could be, and the other people working in the U.S. could draw internationally as well, but what could some of this say to ecosystem management or ecosystem-based management here in the U.S. context? Are there any things here that you'd like to suggest?
My personal view is we're very much in the early stages of delivering the process, but I think being relatively scarce in resources, I think many of our processes that we may be able to institute when we overcome this hurdle of moving to the short to the long term may well be more efficient and cost effective than processes I've seen being developed here. And this is to be controversial, really. There seems to be a great focus here on complexity, on dynamics. The alternative way of looking at the system, and I've had this debate with the Cameo people as well, is to actually look for patterns of constancy, stability, common laws among systems. And the terrestrial ecologists, actually based in the States, have made enormous progress with this. I think of Jim Brown's group, Brian Inquist, people like this. And the marine science community have, I think, ignored this at their peril. And although I hear about a lot of successes in terms of moving towards meeting management objectives, my impression is the science base is becoming overly complex for delivering the types of advice that can be received by the system. So I think the one thing I would say, although I don't feel we're advanced in delivery, I do feel we're advanced in alternate ways of thinking about systems. And I would encourage other nations engaged in management to run a parallel process where they don't focus solely on dynamics and complexity, but they focus on simple laws that underlie common processes and systems. And I think you can go a long way if you understand some of those.
Yeah, this is a bit of a hard one. I guess because I've sort of feel in the position where New Zealand's probably got more to learn from somewhere like the States about ecosystem management, because although we are making steps in that direction, I can see that there's a lot of things going on here that are a lot more advanced and a lot more complex than what we're looking at. And I guess because we just don't have the sort of budget to get into some of the the type of science that's being done here, maybe in the end some of the lessons that we could provide might be how to actually achieve some ecosystem management objectives, and building on your sort of suggestion in a kind of more simplistic way, without trying to make it too complicated. But that'll be something that may happen in the future rather than something that we could point to right now. I guess if Pamela was here and she was a co-author on the paper with me, she's currently in the position of Chief Scientist at the Ministry of Fisheries. One of her things that she felt that New Zealand has done quite well is this business about getting overcapacity under control. And she's very strong in the view that that is a really good first step to ecosystem-based fisheries management. So that's probably about it.
I'm busy taking notes. That was interesting. Please.
I'm kind of curious to hear you guys. There was a recent thing that just came out in, I guess it was News Focus and Science on global fisheries. It was called Détente and the Fisheries War. And it was talking about the worm-hillborn clash. One of the statements that was made by Eric Duckstead in his in the article was this statement, and I'm just going to read it. Fishery scientists see marine ecosystems as a resource to be used, whereas marine ecologists usually envision pristine, unfished habitats as the ideal. Is that true?
I mean, you can separate your scientific life from your life as a member of society, if you so wish, and many scientists believe that's a measure of their own professionalism, the extent to which they can do that. You would see many scientists who would argue that their role is to merely present the consequences of society making alternate choices in management. And I see this fiery debate that was characterised in science being more one about objectives than about the underlying science, although there were some questions about the way in which the original science was conducted. And my personal belief is that science has a role in informing society's choice of objectives, but as a group of scientists we should be able to look at data and ultimately agree on the interpretation we make in relation to any objectives that's been set. So I see it actually as rather a false debate. I mean, it makes for great journalism, but if you get all the data on the table and you look at it hard enough, generally, as a group of professionals, you can reach agreement. There's a second debate about what the marine environment should look like. Some people have a preservationist view, some people have a sustainable use view. We've heard a lot today about the range of models that allow you to look at the trade-offs between those views and the rates of fishing you would impose to get the trade-off you might want. But that is all a debate about objectives. It's not a debate about the underlying science, and I think you should separate those two things.
Well, you want to say something, Frank, about that?
I just would follow that may be the, I mean, I read that article and I didn't particularly like that it characterized the scientists in two camps so completely, but I guess what I would say is that it's probably a pretty good characterization of the constituencies. And we saw that, you know, in this HAMER process, is that basically there were people who were very use-oriented and there were people who were very protection-oriented, and you know, it's a process. For those people who wanted to get really involved, you could see there was a shift over time where their views got moderate from the two poles. It's just the nature of what people are. They tend to choose one perspective and stick with it.
Well, it just in response, I mean, I don't agree with the statement, and in fact, it bothered me quite a bit. I've been in contact a lot with Ray during this process of the clash, and have actually contributed to the debate some myself and some stuff. And what bothers me is that I see ecosystems-based fisheries management as this transition sort of embeds fisheries ecosystems into a larger ecosystem, and that this transition from one to the other in terms of metrics and things is the recognition that in the environment may actually be driving the system as much as fishing itself does. And to me, we didn't hear very much of that today, and we also didn't hear very much today about the role of restoration in the process. Although we've mentioned a couple of times, does that change the expectations of outcomes or time courses, or if restoration is part of the equation? That's sort of the focus of what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, but I don't have an answer. It's a question.
Yeah, good points. I think I would just echo what Simon said. There's kind of the policy or the institutional element where you duke it out and deal with all the objectives, and that's part of this and needs to be. But I think the scientific part is I can go back to my laptop and wipe out all the whales in an ecosystem, or wipe out all the plankton in an ecosystem and simulate that, and then see what the consequence, and a range of scenarios to see what's feasible, what's not, be it choices, restoration, what have you. And I think that is the value of some of the approaches that we're using now with these different models and tools, is that we are able to look at some of these things simultaneously or in concert that we haven't really done as much before.
I'll take off, part of the role of being a moderator is to be an active moderator as well, and to be provocative. So as a person who studies scientists and who does sociology of science, I think one of the things that this gets at is the question of worldviews and social construction of the ocean. And while frequently scientists might say, those people out there have certain social constructions of the oceans, we're just the purveyors of information, it's been shown repeatedly through careful empirical research that in fact scientists do have worldviews, they do have social constructions, and certain kinds of science is represented in certain ways. They may have their own filters they're either aware of or unaware of. And so, I think it's particularly important for the discourse around ecosystem-based management, because people like myself have done literature reviews and looked at the sort of narrative within the discourse around ecosystem-based fisheries management, and there is a very clear narrative. And it represents a particular worldview. And so I'm just opening this up, which is the question of this debate. I'm not trying to say that I think these debates should be open and frank, and they're complicated, but to deny that there are these differences, I think, is to brush under the rug some very important matters. But, please.
Something to contribute to that. I agree wholeheartedly. I think that there is a big culture divide, and that to some extent it coincides with the cultural differences between marine ecology and academia and the ecologists working within the agencies actively managing. And as a younger scientist, you run into this challenge with the journals when you're trying to publish things. You often run into this issue where you're doing that basic science that you think is going to support the EBFM process, but you're actually being evaluated under the rules that really belongs more to the academic science. And I feel like sometimes we get caught in the shuffle a little bit. And I've been trying to figure out how to ask this question, but to put to kind of the older people, but I feel like there is some need for us kind of for some kind of guidance or just maybe even just kind of the people who are actively engaged in all this work that we're being shown to kind of endorse certain kinds of those little science units, those many little science units that are being produced to support this process, to kind of point to which are the contributions that are really helping the EBFMs and help us get some more feedback of making sure that we're doing the right kind of little science units, because I think right now there's some confusion.
Yeah, I think I'd say in general terms, a mark of your professionalism as a scientist should be your ability to examine evidence and to draw a conclusion from that evidence that might be contrary to your view or opinion about the world.
Mm-hmm.
Of course you're influenced by the world and you have opinions as a scientist, But ultimately, I think in the physical sciences, particularly where you're dealing with quantitative, repeatable laws, there's a certainty that doesn't exist in a lot of the science we do, and as a result, there has been this melding of opinion and the science, because you can actually weight the science in different ways depending on your opinion, because there's quite often no solid quantitative test of the work that you're doing. But I think as an aspiration, you know, the professional scientists should be able to separate their worldview from the evidence, and should always strive to achieve that.
Please.
Just to continue on this theme, and it sets up a question I was particularly going to ask Rosie and Simon anyway, but last February, in 3 consecutive weeks in Rome, one could participate in an FAO technical consultation on guidelines for deep sea fisheries on the high seas. The second week, it was the Convention on Biological Diversity SBSTA meeting, their scientific and technical body for advice to CBD. The third week, it was an FAO-organized workshop on food security and climate change, where fisheries was a contributor. All 3 of those were science-based discussions of the use of fisheries in the oceans. One from a regulatory agency, one from an agency that is protecting things in the ocean, and the third one, co-sponsored by FAO and agro-biodiversity, for people who didn't know that such an organization at an international level exists. They were very different discussions of what is the appropriate way for people to use the ocean. 3 very different discussions in 3 very different settings. The question is, what is the setting where those 3 different views of the ocean should be being discussed? Because at the end of the day, there has to be a coherency of decision-making in those 3 different contexts if we're going to see progress in any direction. Where should the dialogue at the higher level occur? And do you have those in Europe? Thinking of like the interesting stress between the German Ministry of Nature and the German Ministry of Fisheries over their Natura 2000 sites, and who's going to manage what? Where should that decision, where should that dialogue be occurring?
I want to catch this for posterity.
I mean, I don't have a firm answer to that, Jake. I mean, all I can refer to is the example of the Marine Strategy Directive, which has played a role in putting environment and fisheries people round the table together. And I would hope that professional scientists supporting that process would offer consistent advice to all the parties who were present at the table, i.e. show them the range of consequences of any series of decisions they might be discussing. But I mean, there is no common forum for this, and in a way it's almost inevitable that there won't be, because of the factional nature of political life. People obviously want to represent constituencies which they have concern about, and they feel they're giving up their power base, if you like, if they join a wider constituency. And I think, as you said yourself in the talk this morning, you see on a very, very common basis that bodies with special interests, I mean particularly NGOs in the world I move in, will drop into whichever group is most likely to support their case. And of course that empowers that group and that perpetuates that group. So I don't have an answer to you, but I think it's an extremely good thing as a scientist to offer the same information to everybody.
I'm not sure I've got an answer either. I'm probably far too jet lagged too. But I guess in New Zealand, if you're talking about high seas, I guess that's a different issue. But in the New Zealand context, because we are largely responsible for managing the fisheries in our zone, and in fact we're quite a small country, then potentially there's possibly more scope for all the various bodies to get together and get involved in some of those things. And I think, you know, over the last few years we've seen a lot more you know, the sort of fisheries and moving towards ecosystem management approaches, we've seen a lot more coordination between the Ministry of Fisheries and the Department of Conservation, for example. So, you know, I think it possibly makes it a bit simpler if you're, you know, you're not having to deal with a whole lot of political issues across a wide range of countries like you are in the EU.
Do you guys, you actually have formal written rules of engagement, don't you, for your Department of Conservation and Ministry of Fisheries? There's a document that outlines how you treat each other.
I'm going to pass on that. I'm going to leave it alone.
There was a ferry and the moderator left. But you know, there's a rule that I think, an empirical rule that we could establish under this particular topic. And you know, once you sort of hear more about Puget Sound tomorrow, you know, anything that goes on the high seas is nothing compared to trying to manage salmon in the Puget Sound. And in fact, the rule is the probability of successfully agreeing a management decision is inversely proportional to the cube of the number of decision makers, which is another way of saying that Europe is toast. Anyway, to any different further questions?
You sound so surprised. It's a little bit more of a quantitative question, which might be ironic coming from a Marine Affairs master's student, but I've read some interesting articles recently regarding fish tagging and its use in models, which seems to have a lot of potential applications on an ecosystem level. So I was wondering if you saw that being used in any of your fisheries, or if you saw any future with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, to give you an idea, there was a short list of things that the managers had when they came in. And like I use that example, connectivity. There was a lot of questions about, do we have animals moving from one atoll to another? Do we have movement between the main islands and the northwestern islands? And some of those things, and fish tracking of certain fish actually was right up at the top of the list. And these projects are moving ahead irrespective, because they were prioritized in this process. Funds from whatever sources started to all of a sudden get moved in that direction because the process had been talked about, and you know, if you go through a structured process of figuring out what's important, suddenly money gets found because they can justify it by simply citing the document and saying this is where we need to go. So yes, absolutely, we've been using fish tracking for a lot of things in our pelagic fishery, definitely, but in this particular HAMER thing, definitely that was one of the first things that was implemented.
George?
I heard the word restoration mentioned, and I was wondering, within this ecosystem context, if we're prepared to try restoration on the high seas. I know that there's some effort to do this with reintroduction of crab stocks, the Bering and nowhere else. But are there possibilities for restoration of some of these systems with active rather than passive activities?
High seas?
Well, coastal ecosystems, in the water, in the ocean.
You mean culling?
Yeah, I guess we have a question. What's active restoration?
Well, if you were trying to restore a meadow, you might do a burn and then outplant native species that you wanted to reestablish. Something I thought we seem to be lacking in some of our forage fish in Puget Sound. It may be absolutely asinine to think about doing this, but what about trying to transplant out, say, sandlands into some beaches where they used to be but are no longer, so that you're putting egg masses into the beach and giving them a chance to reestablish? Is this something on the cards? Capelin would be a situation where it might be relevant also on the Atlantic side. George, let me come back to kind of some of the thoughts we had earlier. Part of this process needs to establish the venue, the institution, for the discussion, debate that incorporates all the objectives, all the worldviews, all the desires, and at some level try to define what it is we're restoring to. So that's part of ecosystem-based management, but that's a process. Then there are the tools, particularly modeling tools, to say what is feasible among all of those things, even if you can define what the objectives are. And then there are the actual management measures that you can try to begin to do that. And I'm not going to take the bait on Caitlin and Sam Hansen. But thank you. But I think that we've often viewed those as separate events, and I think they need to be all linked together. And that's the whole point of an MSE approach, is you develop those objectives, you go in and simulate them at whatever level, you try them, and you then see what the performance is, and you iterate that. And I think that's a way, I think, to move forward to whatever the objectives are, be they restoration or whatever. So.
Then you raise a really interesting question, is what do we want the ecosystem to look like?
Like maybe just give an example of some research that's been going on in New Zealand recently, and that's, I mean, this is a fairly obvious one in terms of restoration. We found that one of our important inshore snappers, inshore fisheries, which is snapper, the juveniles are seem to be very closely associated with 3D structure in estuarine habitats, particularly things like seagrass meadows. And so there's some work going on at the moment looking at putting in artificial 3D structures and actually developing artificial seagrass meadows to try and enhance that habitat for juveniles that's been lost, often through sort of land-based processes, sedimentation, that kind of thing. So I guess that's a fairly obvious example where you could probably carry out some effective research to determine what's really driving success of juveniles in those habitats and what you might be able to do to help restore them. But you still then got the issue of then trying to manage all the other things around it, like the continuing sedimentation processes, which is a much wider management issue.
I was thinking Dr. Hilborn was going to say something about salmon hatcheries under restoration, that he appears to resist the temptations. I'll move to Rick McCall.
Following up on this question of what do we want the ecosystems to look like, I was wondering if you could contrast two worldviews for me. One is that humans are part of the ecosystem, and the other is that humans are invasive species. The new ecosystem is not going to look like the old ecosystem, and our job is trying to figure out what this new ecosystem could look like.
You asked us if we could contrast. I think the answer to that is no.
You want to elaborate?
I think there's a range of perspectives, again, of what people want and what the ecosystem should look like. And that spans the gamut from fishing everything down to the point we have jellies to everybody leaving the planet and stuff in between. And I don't buy into it. I think the thing Simon and Frank were saying earlier, at some level it's a kind of false debate, that it's a gradient of angles, and you need to establish that process where you can have all that put on the table and hash it out and come up to some unpacking of those objectives. So I'm not sure if I addressed the issue directly, but
Let me elaborate a little bit. Within the single species models, the concept of there's an unfished biomass, there's a biomass MSY that